Good afternoon. I hope everyone enjoyed the lunch break, and we're going to talk about food and swallowing now. So it's a natural progression from lunch break. My name is Dominika Lisiecka, and I'm a PhD student here in Ireland in the University College Cork. And as part of my PhD, I looked into the experiences of dysphagia, so swallowing problems in ALS. So I decided to focus on investigating dysphagia in ALS from the perspectives of people living with it every day. So the caregivers and the patients, so people diagnosed with ALS. And in particular, I aimed to research their understanding of dysphagia, the impact of dysphagia on their lives, the main difficulties experienced in relation to dysphagia and the ways of coping with them, and the general perception experiences of the health services received for dysphagia. So after many consideration, I decided to implement the IPA, which is Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, as it was developed by Professor Jonathan Smith in the UK, because I felt that would be the most suitable method to answer my research questions. So IPA is idiographic, which means that you analyze every person separately, very much in depth. It's like a case study approach before you move to cross-case analysis. And the process of analysis is very structured and systematic. However, as a researcher, you are allowed to make your own interpretations, which I liked as well. So the data collection took form of multiple interviews supported by observations. So in total, there were 41 interviews completed with people with ALS or MND and 17 with the caregivers, which resulted in almost 24 hours of audio recordings. And although the exact gap between the interviews was not specified in the start, we aim to complete them from 2 to 4 weeks between each others. So obviously, there were some criteria for the study. We looked at the time post-diagnosis, so we involved people who were diagnosed with ALS for at least 2 months, and they had diagnosis of dysphagia for at least a month. We include people with normal or mildly impaired cognition, as tested by ECAS. In terms of communication ability, the interviews were conducted with people who were able to express themselves at a sentence level, either verbally or through a device or writing. People were rated and self-rated on the voice levels 1 to 5, and all adults. Now, for the caregivers, again, the lack of cognitive impairment was one of the entries for the study, and they had to be involved in dysphagia management, so preparing food or feeding or administering non-oral feeding as well. And they were adults. So I know quite a busy slide, but just general characteristic of the participants. And if you looked at the second column, highlighted the people with ALS at the moment. So I recruited 10 people with ALS, 5 male and 5 female. The mean age was 67.2. 90% had normal cognition. 1 person had very mild cognitive impairment. 90% had a bulbar onset of ALS, and half of this population had a feeding tube in situ. 7 people with ALS were nonverbal at the entry to the study, and 2 more became nonverbal before the second interview was conducted. So I would like to briefly show you the results for the people with ALS. There was an overarching theme living in here and now. And basically, when you conduct a study like that, you don't look for overarching theme. Overarching theme is something that jumps out from the data. It's something that was very important for the participants. So you have to include it, whether you're looking for it or not. So that was the overarching theme, living in the here and now. There were 3 superordinate themes: ALS as a life-changing disease, dysphagia self-management, and professional input for dysphagia. And then there were 7 subordinate themes. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the 3 themes here, as they are relevant for dysphagia. This slide just illustrates high agreement of themes within the sample. So you can see all the blue fields are people who reported the themes. So I'm going to talk to you now about how people with ALS in this study approach dysphagia. And just please remember the overarching theme, living in here and now, because I think it's very relevant to understand participants' attitude towards their swallowing difficulties. Again, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that it emerged that every person I spoke to reported some physical changes in their swallowing in comparison to before ALS. Such as inability to eat specific food, choking and aspiration, coughing, etc. You can see that in the table. However, despite reporting physical signs of dysphagia, 60% of participants still denied having a swallowing problem. So I found that very interesting. Then I looked at what people were doing. So in response to the symptoms experienced, people with ALS developed own strategies to manage. The most commonly reported were modifying consistencies of food, substituting risky food with those with easier consistencies, and monitoring own rate of eating and drinking. Being more careful, generally more careful when eating, was often reported. So these are the developed strategies, which are quite similar to professionals' advice we may give sometimes to manage dysphagia. I would like to read a quote from a lady called Eileen when she was describing her choking and how she managed after that. So I'm eating away and I'm fine, and the next thing I eat a bit of broccoli and it won't swallow. So since that time, how is your eating going? I tend to cook myself. I won't go out anymore because I don't want to. I'm afraid in case something will happen like that. And so I make sure we eat at home, and I cook for myself. I make sure everything is tender. If I have toast, I put loads of butter on it when it's hot to soften it. All these things I do myself. Eileen was actually quite proud when she was saying this, and basically her reaction was not to seek for professional help. Instead, she attempted to deal with dysphagia on her own and developed a set of strategies that she implemented that helped her to manage. And she was actually surprised when she realized how many changes she had implemented to her eating, and she said that she's done all of it almost subconsciously. So as I mentioned before, 60% of people in that study denied having hand and swallowing problems, and Eileen was one of them. And this could be explained, obviously it's one of the explanations, from the perspective of the overarching theme, so living in here and now. So as Eileen was focused on the here and now, as soon as she found a strategy to manage her swallowing problem, dysphagia was not an issue for her anymore. And in terms of consequences of dysphagia, there were many consequences. But I feel that the meaning of food may be an important consideration. So basically, as the people were experiencing dysphagia and developing strategies to manage, their relation with food and the meaning of food for them changed. And I think it might be important because it seemed to impact on the people with ALS decision whether to accept or refuse non-oral feeding, for example. And this is an area that I would like to look at a bit more closely in the future. In terms of the services received for dysphagia, 100% were generally happy. They were generally pleased with the services they got. However, 60% reported some problems, such as limited experience of ALS among some professionals, seeing other people with ALS at different stages of the disease, and communication breakdowns between the services. And I'm just going to give you a few quotes to represent what was said in that regard. Again, Eileen, this is in relation to the services received for dysphagia. Oh, A1, I couldn't say enough about them. It's marvelous. I think it's brilliant, the backup, absolutely brilliant. I couldn't fault a thing. I feel supported 100%, and I see no reason to change anything, you know. Sheila, I don't like it, and she meant MND clinics. The team are lovely. So I said, okay, there is something you don't like, and I would like to know what. Looking at other people, different stages. Again, that could be understood from the perspective of the overarching theme, living in here and now. It can be quite disturbing to that, because living in here and now is also one of the main coping strategies in this study. Eileen again, especially when the whole group are in front of you, you dread it before you go. So in Ireland, some services are provided through MND clinics. So basically it's a group of professionals in one room, so a person with MND would come in and see the group of professionals at the same time. So that's what they're referring to. Joseph, community speech therapist texts me every few months. She decides whether or not to visit me based on my self-analysis. It is not for me to decide how often my swallow should be tested. Mike. With regards to the visit to gastroenterologist, I was given a lot of information about the subject by Dr. Smith, a huge amount to take in on the first appointment. He was absolutely overwhelmed with that, and that was in relation to non-oral feeding, actually. Terence, I was pleased that she, SLT, thought I was not bad. And I think that was very important because people with ALS, MND may not get a lot of positive news when they see health professionals. So Terence was extremely happy just to be told he's not too bad. So briefly, the caregivers, and when I thought about the whole journey and the massive data that I gathered, it just, for me, the metaphor I could use is slacklining. When you walk on the rope, so you're trying to balance, but the rope isn't stretched, it actually bounces, so it makes it much more difficult. And that's, for me, how the journey of the caregivers looked like. So they were, same table, okay, we just look at the third column now. So they were 10 caregivers as well. The majority, 80%, were female, 6 were spouses, and 4 were adult children of someone with ALS MND. And again, the results, again, there was an overarching theme that emerged from the data, transformation. Similarly, there were 3 superordinate themes: immersion in the caregiving as an act of slacklining, change attitude towards food, and professional input for dysphagia. And I'm just going to talk to you briefly on the 2 themes, focus on safety and service provision. So again, this is to illustrate that the agreement was very high, even higher than in population of people with ALS, MND, the agreement of themes. So the focus of on safety. So the caregivers of people with ALS and dysphagia perceived eating as a very risky activity. And their main focus was on ensuring the safety of the person with MND or ALS. Therefore, they were focused on excluding dangerous foods, change way of preparing food, constant supervision. They also reported to me that they considered feeding tubes to be a life-prolonging options. And most of the caregivers wished that the person with ALS would opt for a feeding tube, although some of them were unsure of their own ability to manage the tube at home. And the main concern was in relation to maintaining appropriate hygiene. What's interesting is that the above strategies were often implemented covertly. So one lady said to me, I prepare lunch for my husband differently, but my husband doesn't know. So instead of cutting a sandwich in 4, I cut now in 6 or 8, but I don't tell him that. And likewise, people with ALS were doing things that the caregivers wouldn't know because it was all done cognitively. There were many themes that emerged in relation to the professional services, and I'm going to focus on the issue of timing. Just to, I suppose, outline generally that the caregivers seem to go through a sequence of stages post-diagnosis, and the initial phase is usually shock. And in this study, the phase of shock lasted for at least 2 to 3 months. And after that, the participants seemed to adjust to their living with ALS. And that was the time where they were trying to implement different strategies to cope. So just a quote, it's quite a long quote from Marta. And she described her experience when all of a sudden she was seen by a speech language therapist who just said, I think your husband needs a PEG tube now. And so she reflected on it, and she said, around the swallow, I just felt that she didn't need to happen, that lady, that visit at that particular time, because it might have been, hi, I'm speech lady from palliative care, and I will be seeing you at some point would have been enough. I think she could have just introduced herself if she wanted to, or not even bother at all. And that first contact with speech therapist had negative impact on the relation with SLT, and actually caused Marta to be a little bit reluctant to avail of the services in the future. And it seemed important, you can see in the second quote, that there was another speech therapist who saw Marta. Marta was the caregiver, but she attended jointly with her husband about 2 months after, and it was a very, very different experience, so the time was important. And so it seems important that we should coordinate professional recommendations and the level of service in general with the current state and abilities of the person, be it the caregiver or the person with ALS. And so just to summarize some considerations for health professionals that emerged in this study, to understand someone's swallowing, experience of swallowing or experiences of dysphagia, we need to look beyond the swallowing alone. there may be a difference between personal perception of dysphagia and the real impairment, just to be aware of it. People with ALS, MND attempt to self-manage their dysphagia, and they can do it often subconsciously. Dysphagia change approach to food in both groups. Approach to food can influence the acceptance or refusal of artificial feeding. Clinic approach can be extra stressful for some people. Some caregivers ask for individual appointments without the person with MND ALS being present. And the last one, participants valued good news and when the professionals were supportive, respectful, at ease, and nice. And I would like to acknowledge all people who took part in the project, my supervisory team, Health Research Board, and the Irish MND Association and the Speech and Language Therapy departments in Munster for the help with recruitment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there questions? Down here.
Thank you.
I still hope I can make my point. I'm a former primary caregiver, and I remembered a lot of situations with my husband when the quotes, I just went back in that situation. Self-management is a very important coping strategy, and there's still a lot of resistance. And the moment my husband had an artificial feeding, a pack, then he said, this is something I could have done much more earlier. And that's, a lot of emotions are coming up. I think this morning we heard caregivers are like Sherpas, the professional caregivers and the family caregivers. And for the caregivers, artificial feeding is a great relief. And after we had much more time for our relationship without the fear and fighting with the swallowing.
Thank you very much for this comment. I almost always felt during that study that the perception of the caregivers were different in relation to non-oral feeding that they were for the people with ALS. But generally speaking, I think it's very, very individual. Even last night I was trying to look up the literature to see, do we have any new guidelines on the timing of the recommended insertion for the PEG or RIG or whatever. But I think it is very, very individual. And in this study, 2 people had very significant concerns in relation to would they be able to cope with the tube at home, which I think with the right support could be really overcome for them. And also maybe to say that the study took place in the south part of Ireland, which involves many rural areas. So a lot of people had to travel, let's say, for 80 kilometers to access a hospital. So I think that might be another impact on how much people were trying to self-manage. Because people with ALS were aware that if they want to access healthcare, it's additional burden for the caregiver because they would have to bring them somewhere else. So that was another, I suppose, factor.
Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.